Go Large, Go Small, Our 1980s. Written by Yi Han. We are small when we are made to face change. We are large when we choose to face it. Chapter 1. Open. By the dim light of the cigarette, he looked at the file on the desk. He reached for another and struck it against his palm out of habit before he remembered the pack was already empty. He tore it open anyway and threw it into the corner of the room. The ashtray beside him was already full, cigarette after cigarette put out and left standing on end among the others. And still he kept striking the lighter, on and off, on and off. The small sound of the flint, the only sound in the room for what felt like a long time. He had been sitting there since the afternoon, and the light outside the window had gone from gray to orange to nothing, and he had not once gotten up to turn on a lamp. The clicking stopped. He threw the lighter, hard, into the same corner. The papers on the desk in front of him read, at the top of the first page, Application for Bankruptcy, and he had not gotten much further than that all afternoon. Finally, he swept them up in one motion, wrapped them together, and stood up to walk toward the parking lot. He started the car. In the side mirror, the sign still hung over the dark warehouse. Kessler Auto Shop. Red letters on white, same as it always had. He stared at it a moment in the cold. It was the same kind of night, 2 years ago almost to the week, that he had stood under that same sign for the first time, so full of something that felt like hope he could hardly stand still. He was John Kessler, 27 years old. He'd started fixing cars back in high school, working in his father's garage after class. His hands smelled permanently of grease, no matter how hard he scrubbed them. He'd been smart in school, and popular too. The kind of boy teachers liked and other boys wanted to stand near. Smoking was welcomed everywhere back then, in the halls, behind the gym, at the diner where the older boys sat, and John learned it early. His classmates were jealous of him for it. John's smoking made him seem a step ahead, already halfway into the adult world. His parents knew the first time he left the smell of it in his room. They only asked once, "John, did you smoke?" "No, not at all." They let it be. His mother, especially, never seemed to mind, even when his father grumbled about it once or twice. Cigarettes weren't high on her list of things to worry about. What she believed, the thing she said so often it stopped sounding like an opinion and started sounding like weather, was that they were going to get rich one day. Somehow. Someday soon. She'd said it to John since before he could understand what it meant. By the time he could, the wanting had already worked its way into him, so that even as a boy, lying on the grass, cleaning the grease off his hands, some part of him was already reaching for something bigger even than the sky above him. Back 2 years ago in the spring, John Kessler had worn his good shirt when he signed the papers for his own auto repair shop. The radio had been on in the shop during his rest. President Reagan had just announced his new economic plan. The radio was full of the new president's confidence. Tax cuts, a stronger dollar, better days coming. It was said with the kind of ease that hadn't been on the radio in years, not since the bad inflation and the high unemployment of the 70s had settled over everything like weather nobody expected to lift. The hosts analyzed that the worst part was already behind them, and John nodded his head. He sat there resting his back for a few minutes, legs crossed one over the other. He also counted in his head, again, everything he and Ellie had put away over the years to make this day possible. John had been quick with an engine since before he even finished high school, and quicker still in the couple of years after, working other men's garages. People around town started asking for him by name. He had a way of getting a car back on the road faster than anybody expected. He had a way of talking to customers too, one that made them feel like the only person in the shop that day. Parts came in slow and cost more every year, even as cheaper versions of the same parts started showing up from overseas. A distributor cap that had run $2 when he started charged closer to $5 by the time he left to open his own place. And most folks in town still paid in cash, counted out in bills that had been folded in a pocket all week. because a lot of them didn't trust checks any more than they trusted banks. It wasn't long before people were sending their brothers and cousins and neighbors to find John specifically. The kind of trust that spread by word of mouth in a town that size, one loyal customer vouching for the next. His life had been, up to that point, a quite smooth one. He'd put away enough money working other men's garages to open a shop of his own, faster than most men managed it. His mother had always been the one pushing him toward it. Have your own place, John. Get rich sooner instead of working your life away for somebody else's name on the sign. There was something in the phrase itself, business owner, that John liked more than he ever said out loud. He'd married his high school sweetheart, Ellie, not long after graduation. The shop and the marriage had always felt, in his mind, like parts of the same plan. Older Mr. Kessler was a quiet man, nothing like his wife. He'd drawn a steady paycheck from the telephone company for most of his working life, right up until he retired. He hardly talked at all. He was the kind of man who sat in a room while his wife did the talking around him, nodding now and then, saying little. Sometimes John thought his father didn't have an ambition in his whole body. His life ran as accurate as a clock, and about as interesting. Same hours, same seat at the table, same 2 words in answer to most questions. John used to call him the vintage car, just between the two of them, and his mother would giggle every time, covering her mouth like a girl. She'd had a photograph taken of John on his first day at the shop, standing under the new sign with his arms crossed. She'd had it framed, a big frame, out of proportion to the picture itself, and hung it where anyone who came to the house would see it. Anytime there were guests, she found a way to bring it up. Her son, 25 years old, already owning his own auto shop, a business with his name on it. She said it every time like it was the first time she'd ever thought to mention it. So when John finally had enough money to open his own shop, the first person he thought of was DT. They had known each other since grade school. They hung out together, smoked together, and got sent to the principal's office together more times than either of them could count. They knew each other's names better than their own parents called them by. They were bros, plain and simple, the kind of pals other men were a little envious of. John used to claim he trusted DT as much as he trusted his own parents, and he meant it every time he said it. Someday we're going to do something big, he used to tell his mother and father, DT standing right there beside him nodding along. Neither of them had a dollar to his name yet. Neither of them cared. DT was also good with an engine himself. He could be a good assistant, John deeply believed. Back when they were boys who didn't know any better, DT used to say that if John ever got his own place someday, he'd want to be the one turning the wrenches for him. The next day, John got out the phone book, found DT's number, and dialed it before he could think twice about it. DT was happy to come on. "Oh, I'll pay you fair," John said into the phone. Ellie stood at the sink with her hands in the dishwater, listening without turning around. "Nobody in 3 counties can time an engine like you. You run the bays, I'll run the front. Talk to the customers, keep the register straight. We'll go big." DT said he was in before John had even finished asking. Several times while he talked, Ellie paused her dishes, then went back to the cleaning. After he hung up, she dried her hands on her apron and whispered softly, "If that's what you want to do, I am happy for you, John. What would you like to have for dinner?" Ellie cared more about the meal than the money, or seemed to. She wanted to celebrate too, in her own way, and she turned the thought over for a moment, weighing whether to say so. "Whatever," John said, lying back on the couch and then bouncing back up suddenly. "You can eat earlier with the kids. I'm going to get out and meet DT tonight. We need to celebrate it. Set the alarm clock for an hour, would you?" Ellie held her words. John lay back down again and started to snore. It was not enthusiasm. It was also not refusal. It was the sound of a woman who had learned, in 7 years of marriage, that John's mind, once made up, did not move for anybody, and that there was no version of this conversation where her worry would change the outcome, only her own peace for the evening. She had 2 children under 4, and she had longed to be a housewife since she was a little girl. She hadn't liked school much. Her classmates used to make fun of her, shy, unpopular, tongue-tied, and it was either her siblings fighting back on her behalf, or her just putting up with the laughing and the meanness. Not once could she bring herself to shout back at those kids. She only ever walked away. Her siblings tried sometimes to teach her how to fight back. She just smiled at them. Ellie set the alarm clock for 5 and put it down, and her fingers slipped to the edge of their wedding photo, sitting where it always sat. She could still say, honestly, that she'd been happy to marry him right after high school. On their wedding day, she'd had the best day of her life and smiled the whole way through it, even though they couldn't afford a proper wedding dress. She'd worn her best dress instead and hadn't minded at all. Looking at the photograph now, she couldn't quite square the girl in it with the woman standing in this kitchen. That girl hadn't known yet about diapers, about grocery money stretched thin toward the end of the week, about the particular kind of tired that never fully left a body once the second child came. She thought, sometimes, about what her children would grow up into, whether the boy would be steady like her own father had been, or restless like John, always reaching past what was in front of him for something further off. She hoped, without letting the hope go any further than that neither of them would end up needing to be as patient as she had learned to be. It wasn't a thought she knew how to finish, so she didn't try. She put the photograph back exactly where it had been sitting and went to check on the stove. At 5, the alarm went off. John woke, cleaned himself up in a hurry, and before he left, he pointed a finger at her, smiling. "It's going to work, dear. I promise you that." He meant it. That was the thing about John. He always meant it, in the moment he said it, with his whole chest. Whether it turned out to be true was a separate matter. Ellie felt a quiet satisfaction just watching him this happy. The next day, John brought DT to the building on Route 9, which had been a feed store before it sat empty for 2 years, and it took most of the spring to get it right. New bay doors, a lift installed secondhand from an outfit going under in Terre Haute. Kessler, Auto Shop, it said, in red letters on white, and the morning they hung it, John stood across the road with his hands in his pockets and looked at it longer than he needed to. "There it is," John said, standing beside him, grinning around a cigarette. "Look at that." "Here, buddy." "Good work," DT said, and patted him on the shoulder. They opened in June. Every dollar in it was John's own, and everything about it felt as fresh and untested as the new economic policy the radio kept talking about. A clean start, nothing owed to anybody, the whole thing riding on nothing but its own momentum. The town did need a garage. That part at least was true, and true things have a way of covering for the parts that aren't. There was already a Sinclair station on the other side of the town that did some repair work on the side, and Old Man Petrie's place out past the tracks, half retired and slow as molasses, but neither of them could touch John for speed or manner, and word got around fast in a town that size. Business came, slower than DT had promised, but steadier than John had feared. And for a few months that summer, there was a version of the future that seemed to be arriving on schedule. John worked under cars until his back ached and came home smelling of grease and metal, and Ellie worried less for a while than she had at the start. He'd come in the door at 6 and pick up whichever of the kids was closest and swing them up over his head, until Ellie, with a soft laugh, would murmur something about how they'd just eaten, and he'd set the child down, laughing too. Some nights, closing up, DT would toss him a beer from the cooler he kept in the back and say something like, "Told you, didn't I? Told you we'd have this place full." And John would laugh and say, "You told me a lot of things." And DT would grin and say, "Yeah, and how many of them came true," and clink his bottle against John's. And for a minute or two, it felt like they were 17 again, still boys who didn't know any better, still certain the whole world was going to work out exactly the way they'd planned it on somebody's porch. It was one of those nights, loose with beer and good feeling, that John told DT not to bother running every little job up to the front. "You're back there anyway," John said. "Somebody wants to pay you cash for something quick. Just take it, save us both the walk. Don't forget to write them down." He meant it as a kindness, one friend easing the load on another, and DT just nodded like it was nothing, like it hardly needed saying at all. How was today? It was the first thing Ellie asked every night, the moment he came through the door. By then, the shop had become one of her own sources of happiness, too. "They're good," John would say, already pulling off his work clothes. "DT and I had a busy day. More customers than yesterday." He never quite found better words for the feeling, so he kept saying some version of the same thing, night after night. There was a stretch that summer, July, maybe the first half of August, when John Kessler believed, with the whole uncomplicated confidence of a man who had never had to examine his own life too closely, that he had finally arrived somewhere. John ran the front himself. The register, the ledger, the customers walking in the door. And he was good at all of it, better than he'd expected to be, squaring the numbers every night before he closed up. What he didn't watch, because it had never once occurred to him that he needed to, was DT, back in the bays, out of earshot of the counter. It seemed, at first, like DT doing him a favor. A quick job, a customer in a hurry, DT waving them off before they even got up to the front. Don't worry about the desk, just pay me, I'll square it away. One less line at the register, one more satisfied customer out the door faster than he expected. John thought it made the place look efficient. He never once thought to ask where that cash went after it left the customer's hand. His mother came to see the shop once, that August, driven over by his younger sister, and she stood in the doorway of the office looking at the sign through the window from the inside. Kessler Auto Shop spelled out backward in the glass, and she put a hand over her mouth the way she did when she was pleased about something and said, "Well, look at you." She said it twice more before she left, and John understood, the way he'd understood most things about her his whole life, that this was as close as she came to saying she was proud. Not quiet about it exactly, not like his father, but never quite landing on the words either, so that a man had to take the hand over the mouth and the repeating of a sentence as the whole of what she meant. Once, that same August, Ellie asked him at dinner whether they ought to start putting a little money aside again, now that things were going well. "We could use a cushion," she said, "just in case." John waved his fork at her, not unkindly. "Ellie, we're not going to need a cushion. This thing's only going up from here." She didn't push it. For the first year, DT started leaving the shop occasionally. An afternoon here, a morning there. John took it for what it looked like. A young single man who needed some unexpected time to himself now and then. And DT always came back after a short leave. So John didn't make anything of these small things. The customers kept growing steadily anyway, and there seemed no reason to. By the end of the first year, DT wasn't showing up almost half the week. "Bad days for my family," he'd say. The same easy excuse every time. John did the work himself on those days and started coming home later and later. In the second year, the absences stretched into weeks. John would call, and DT would pick up half asleep or half interested, brush him off with a joke, and hang up before any real answer came. But he still appeared some days, steady enough with a wrench when he did, so John kept telling himself it was only a rough stretch, nothing that needed looking into. One afternoon that same year, a regular named Wendell Ashcroft, waiting on a brake job, said it to John outright, not unkindly, just the way a man says a thing he's been turning over. "You sure DT's keeping good track back there? Man like that, always coming and going. I'd want eyes on my own register." John laughed it off. "DT's solid," he said. "Known him since we were kids." Wendell shrugged and let it drop, and John never thought of it again until much later, when it came back to him whole, word for word. There was a night, too, closer to that October, when John sat down with the week's numbers and something in the total didn't sit right against how full the lot had looked all week. He almost pulled the tickets to check them one by one against what DT told him he'd done. He got as far as reaching for the drawer before DT called out from the back that he was starving. Did John want to grab dinner before the diner closed? And John let the drawer close and went, because checking would have meant, in some small way, that he didn't trust him. And John didn't want that to be true about himself any more than he wanted it to be true about DT. It was that October, in the second year, when John finally said something. He mentioned to DT that the week's take seemed light against how busy the bay had looked, and DT laughed and said something about a run of cheap jobs. A customer who'd promised to settle up later and clapped him on the shoulder and asked if he wanted to get a beer. And John went, because that was the kind of friendship it was. The kind held together by beers and shoulder claps, and a shared belief that men who trusted each other didn't need to check. Ellie noticed something subtle as well. It was in the way he talked about the shop at dinner. Less about the work now, more about DT. What DT had said. What DT was going to do next. As if John were narrating someone else's plan rather than describing his own business. She started keeping the household accounts a little more carefully that fall, not because anyone had asked her to, and not because she could have said what she was watching for. She just found herself writing the grocery total down twice some weeks, checking it against what was left in the tin on top of the icebox, the way a person checks a lock they already know is fastened. She didn't say anything about it to John. She had learned, too, that there was a kind of worry that only made things worse to speak out loud, that saying a fear could sometimes be the thing that let it in the door. And so she kept hers where she kept most things, folded small and put away, and she watched her husband come home each night. Still smiling, still certain, still telling her it was all going to work out. And she wanted, more than she let herself admit even to herself, to believe him. Toward the end of that October, DT simply stopped showing up. There was no single dramatic morning to point to. No empty drawer, no note. He just didn't come in on a Tuesday, and then not on the Wednesday after that, and by the end of the week John had stopped expecting to hear his truck pull in. A few days later, he heard from someone in town that DT had cleared out of the house he rented on the east side. He tried the house anyway and got no answer. He called DT's brother in Terre Haute, who said he hadn't heard from him in a month and didn't sound surprised exactly, which was its own kind of answer. It was a customer, not a bank, who put the shape of it together for him. Around noon, a man named Harlan Pruitt came by looking for DT, wanting to know why his truck was making the same noise DT had supposedly fixed 3 weeks back. Harlan said he'd paid DT $80, cash, right there in the bay. Never got a receipt, never thought to ask for one, because DT had told him not to bother waiting up at the register. He'd take care of it himself and save him the trouble. John didn't have a ticket for that truck. He didn't have a ticket for the Pruitt job at all. He spent the rest of that afternoon going back through a month of his own ledger, matching what was written down against what he could remember rolling through the bay doors, and by the time he was done, he had a list in his head of cars he was certain had come through the shop and never once been counted. Nothing so clean as a number missing from a drawer, nothing anybody could point to and call stealing in a courtroom sense. Just money that had never once passed in front of him to be stolen from in the first place. Taken quietly, a customer at a time, by a man who knew exactly how much John trusted him not to check. He did not remember driving home. He remembered later, standing in his own driveway for some amount of time. He could never afterwards say how long, with the truck door still open and the engine still running, looking at the house, at the kitchen window where the light was on, where Ellie was already starting dinner, not yet knowing, for a few more minutes, that anything in their life had changed. He thought of his mother's voice, the one she used to say it in. Have your own place, John. Get rich sooner instead of working your life away for somebody else's name on the sign. And for the first time in his life, the sentence did not sound like encouragement. It sounded like something closer to a curse, a thing said so many times in one house that it had worked itself, without anyone intending it, into the bones of the son who heard it. He turned the truck off. He went inside. He did not know yet what he was going to say, only that whatever it was, he would have to be the one to say it. Almost carelessly, once he was through the door, he asked Ellie how much they still had put away. Just to see, he said, just to know where things stood. It was the first time in over a year he'd asked her that question instead of the other way around. And he asked it lightly, like it didn't matter much either way, so that she wouldn't think to ask him why he wanted to know. He understood, standing there waiting for her answer, that after tonight, the sign on Route 9 would mean something different than it had meant that morning in June when he stood across the road and looked at his own name painted there in red, and had believed, without a shadow of doubt, that it was the truest thing anyone had ever told him about himself. That had been last October. It was November now, and the sign was still up, because taking it down cost money too, and there was none left for that either. The lawyer had filed the papers on a Tuesday and told him it would take a few months to clear, and had said it kindly, the way a doctor says something kindly when there's nothing left to do about it. The engine had been idling the whole time, running against the cold. Through the windshield, the sign hung dark over the dark building, his own name in it. He looked at it a while longer, the papers still on the seat beside him, before he finally put the truck in gear. A car went by on Route 9, slowed, and did not stop. He would have to go home. Ellie would have dinner on. The kids would want him, and there was no version of tonight where he got to sit alone in the dark for as long as he wanted. There never was any more. He pulled out onto the road and did not look back at the sign in the mirror. He knew without looking that it was still there. The drive took 11 minutes. He did not remember any of them. He parked in his usual spot and sat a moment while the engine ticked, cooling, the papers still on the seat where he'd set them down hours ago. Through the kitchen window, Ellie moved back and forth in front of the stove, the light on same as always. For a moment, he just watched her, the way a man watches something he's about to have to disturb. He walked past her without a word and lit a cigarette on the couch, in the dark of the living room, the papers thrown down on the floor beside him, still squared the way he'd squared them all afternoon. It took him the better part of a minute to smoke it. Near the end, he blew a slow ring and watched it come apart above him. He lay back and stared at the ceiling. Ellie hadn't come into the living room once since he'd walked in. She already knew. Chapter 2. Down. She found a chair and sat down at the dining table. The dining table could hardly be called that anymore. Bills, flyers, and the children's toys had buried almost every surface, leaving only a small clear space where a plate might fit, as if even the table had given up trying to stay orderly. Most nights, Ellie carried John's food to him on a tray instead. She was used to serving him, and he was used to being served. Her hand came up and clamped over her mouth, her teeth pressing into her own palm, and the room filled with the click of the lighter from the other side of the wall, over and over, then nothing. She could not have said, if anyone had asked her, what exactly she guessed she knew. It was not a thought so much as a weight, settling into her chest the way cold settles into a house overnight, room by room. She got up and opened the refrigerator to see if there was something better she could serve for dinner. She stood there a long moment with the cold air on her face, looking at nothing in particular. "John, would you like to have dinner?" she asked gently from the kitchen. The children were down the hall, and for once they were quiet too, as if the house itself had asked them to be. The quiet didn't hold for long. The children started quarreling and fighting noisily again, some argument over a toy or a turn at something, their voices rising through the wall. "John, would you like to have dinner?" She repeated the words. No answer came. She had learned, long before John Kessler, that some silences were not hers to break, that a man working something over in his own chest needed the room to do it in, and that a wife who went in asking questions before he was ready only made herself the target of whatever he hadn't finished feeling yet. Her own mother had taught her that, without ever once saying it in words. You wait. You let the house be quiet. You find something for your hands to do. She stood at the open refrigerator until the cold air raised the hair on her arms. She closed it without taking anything out. She wiped down the counter instead, though it didn't need wiping. He's just tired. It's been a long week. The children were hungry, and they wandered back into the kitchen, and the older boy asked his mother if they could have some food. Ellie wrung her hands together and finally called out, "John, could the kids have dinner now? They look hungry." It was almost 8 when he finally came to the kitchen doorway. He hadn't washed his face. His beard had run together with his hair, messy and unkempt in a way she'd never seen on him. It was the first time she had ever really seen him look aged, weathered, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Ellie. That was all he managed. Just her name, and something folding in his voice around the 2 syllables of it that she had never once heard fold before. She had been quickly stuffing biscuits into the 2 kids' hands, and she stopped mid-motion, a few biscuits falling to the ground. "The shop," he said. He stopped. He tried again. "DT, the money's gone. Ellie, I don't know how to say this so it sounds like anything other than what it is. It's gone. All of it. He stopped a second time, and this time he didn't try again right away. She was heating dishes on the stove, and she tried several times to light it, failing each time, before she found the second lighter, dusty from disuse, and the small clicking sound of it hovered through the kitchen. John quickly took the lighter from her hand and held her by the arms. "The shop is gone. Ellie, the shop, it's gone. Do you understand me? It's gone." He was gripping her arms with all his strength now, searching her face for something, anything. "Say something. The shop is gone. Did you hear what I just said? It's gone, He stopped, out of words, still holding on. She just looked at him. After a moment, his hands loosened on her arms. She looked down at her arms, wiped her hands over her apron, and then picked her lighter back up off the ground. What she said was, "Okay." She put the lighter back in the drawer. She felt many things arrive at once and could not have named which one came first. There was a flat, gray nothing that seemed to want to spread over the whole kitchen. There was, underneath that, a weight she recognized but couldn't describe. The same weight she'd felt lying next to her mother's hospital bed as a girl, watching a machine breathe for a woman who wasn't going to wake up. a weight too large for any single word to carry. She had heard later from an aunt who shouldn't have told her that her mother hadn't given her enough water as an infant. Some long stretch of neglect that had nearly cost Ellie her sight before a visiting doctor caught it in time and set things right. She had never once asked her mother about it. There was, quicker than either of those, and gone almost before she noticed it, a small cold flare of fear. Not for herself, but for the children down the hall. For what a life with no money in it might ask of two people who hadn't yet learned to walk properly. And she put it out the way she put most things out by simply refusing to look at it any longer than she had to. And underneath all of that, quiet as a held breath, she felt herself go back. Back to being the infant who couldn't yet ask for water. Back to being the girl in the schoolyard who only ever smiled and walked away. The feeling arrived without words, the way it always had. John held his arm across his face, turning his body sideways toward the wall. Then he turned back around to face Ellie, waiting for something. "Say something," he said finally. "Ellie, please." She looked at him for a long moment. Somewhere behind her eyes a great deal was happening. A whole life's worth of practice at not saying things, running its course, doing exactly what it had been trained to do since she was a girl too small to fight back against anyone, and none of it showed on her face at all. "John, would you, want to have some dinner?" she asked. Then she picked up the dish towel. "The children need dinner." She did not cry in front of him. She had never once, in 9 years of marriage, cried in front of him. Not on their wedding day when she was so happy she could have. Not now. She waited until his voice, through the wall, had gone back to something like normal. Then she slipped into the bathroom, turned the water on in the sink there, low, and let it run over her hands, and looked at herself in the mirror. A few tears dropped from her eyes unexpectedly. She thought of her own mother, standing at a kitchen sink much like this one, hands under water much like this. She had not understood it as a girl. She understood it now. The same running water, some different time, some different place, the same standing position. She turned the water down gradually, her eyes on the mirror but not really seeing herself, until only the last drop fell. Then she tightened the tap, dried her hands, and left the bathroom. She went to call the children for dinner. Later, after the dishes, after the children were down, after John had gone quiet again on the couch with a cigarette he wasn't really smoking so much as holding, Ellie sat at the kitchen table with the lamp off, in the dark, the way she sometimes did when she needed to think and did not want anyone to see her doing it. She thought about the tin on top of the icebox and what was in it and how far that would go. She thought about the two children asleep down the hall and what they'd need right now. She remembered the words they'd sworn to each other on their wedding day. No matter rich or poor, we would be through it together. And she let herself sit with that a moment before getting up. Somewhere behind her, down the hall, one of the children turned over in their sleep and settled again into quiet. She got up then and went to the tin on top of the icebox and counted out what was in it. She carried it to the living room where John still sat with the cigarette gone cold between his fingers, and set it down on the couch beside him without a word, the way she might set down his supper or his coffee in the morning. He looked up at her. She didn't wait for him to say anything. She went back to the kitchen, rinsed the coffee pot for the morning, and went to bed. Chapter 3. Away. John took the money Ellie had set down on the couch beside him that night. He smoked half the cigarette down, then picked up the rolled application for bankruptcy papers from where they'd sat since that first night, and touched the end of the cigarette to a corner of them until they caught it. He was laughing as they burned. Shortly after, he got up and went to change into clean clothes. Within the first week, he had driven to a parts distributor 2 counties over and put nearly all of it down on a large order of parts. Good parts, expensive parts, the kind he'd always believed a shop needed to be taken seriously. He never once stopped to think about the cheaper parts coming in from overseas now, the ones half the town had already started buying without telling him, because in John's mind price and quality had always been the same thing, and a man who wanted to do right by his customers paid for the good stuff. He told himself the whole drive back that this, finally, was the smart move, the one clean thing he could still do right. He had the parts stacked in the back of the shop before he'd even worked out how he meant to reopen it. The repair work that trickled in barely kept him occupied half the time now, and fewer people wanted the kind of expensive parts he'd bet everything on. Most folks just needed the cheap fix, the quick patch, not the good parts sitting boxed in the back. He went to the landlord that same week, thinking there might still be some delay he could arrange on the lease. The landlord wouldn't meet with him. He sent a lawyer to take care of it instead. The lawyer wanted more than what was left just to look at the paperwork. In the end, there was nothing left to do but let the parts sit, half paid for, one more debt folded into the larger one, and put what little remained toward the lawyer anyway, just to file the papers properly and be done with it. He didn't tell Ellie exactly how much he'd spent trying to save something that turned out to already be past saving, or what he'd spent it on. She didn't ask him for a number. They spent Christmas that winter same as always, mostly, though the lawyer had gone off for the holidays and nothing moved on the paperwork for weeks. John's mother still repeated the same thing she always said, how proud she was that John had his own auto shop, and John told her, "We'll open a second shop soon, Mom. You'll be even happier for me then." She giggled the way she always did, hearing it, and John smiled back at her and did not correct a single word of it. In the beginning of January, John still opened the shop half the week, out of habit more than anything, taking the odd repair job that came in. Before long, the office was buried again. Bills this time instead of dreams, parts he couldn't sell, an ashtray that never emptied. The shop stopped being a shop in any real sense and became something closer to a warehouse, a place to store the wreckage of what it used to be. On the last 2 days, he still tried calling DT, and still no one ever answered the phone. On the last day of January, he closed it for good. He had to ask the lawyer for a fresh copy of the application, since the first one had gone up in smoke on the couch back in November, and by February there was nothing left in any account to argue about, so the bankruptcy went through clean, with no more delays left to buy. By then, John had already been to every garage within 20 miles that might have use for a man who could time an engine faster than anybody in 3 counties, and every one of them had said, in one way or another, the same thing. Not right now. It wasn't that they didn't believe him. Wendell Ashcroft's cousin ran the Texaco station on the north end of town, and he looked at John over the counter and said plainly, "I know you're good, John. Everybody knows you're good. But the parts, the cars overseas, they're cheaper now, and people's tastes have changed for them. I've decided to retire once I sell off what parts I've got left." The Sinclair place said something close to the same. Old man Petrie, half retired, laughed without meaning anything unkind by it, and said he could barely keep himself in work, let alone hire somebody who used to be his competition. But he offered to buy back the parts John still had sitting in the shop at a third of what John had paid for them, and gave him 3 days to decide. John took the offer. There wasn't much else to do with parts nobody local wanted anymore, and a third of something was still more than the nothing he'd have been left with otherwise. Petrie's truck came for them within the week, and John watched the crates go and did not say much about it to anyone. He tried other things. He answered an ad for a delivery route and didn't get it. He put in for a job loading trucks at the feed distributor outside town, got as far as a second conversation, and lost it to a man with 2 years less experience and no bankruptcy filed 8 weeks back. That counted for something John was learning, in a way he hadn't expected it to. Word traveled in a town that size. He'd built his whole life on that fact. People knowing his name, passing it along. Go see John. He's the one you want. Now the same current ran the other way, just as fast. He was the man whose shop had gone under. He was the man his partner had ruined while he wasn't looking. People were kind to his face. He heard, secondhand, what some of them said when his face wasn't there to hear it. Ellie, of course, heard the news not long after. A neighbor stopped her on the walk one afternoon. "Hi, Mrs. Kessler. How are you?" Ellie didn't say anything back. She only smiled. He came home one night and handed her some money without any explanation. "Ellie, you know," John said, lighting a cigarette. "The shop is gone this time. I'm wiped out." He took a drag, leaving behind the smell of alcohol. "I did my best." He paused. "But people change. They like cheaper things now. Those old bones only offered a third of what I paid for my parts." Ha ha ha. John couldn't help laughing, and the cigarette's ember dropped, unnoticed, onto the carpet. Ellie poured a glass of water onto the carpet instead of saying anything at first. "It's okay, John," she said. checking the small burnt holes it left behind. "I know, John." John fell onto the couch and began to snore heavily almost at once. Ellie covered him with a blanket. John's mother heard the news soon enough too. From who exactly nobody in the family ever settled on. And she came by the house the next afternoon, driven again by John's younger sister. John saw her step out of the car through the front window and went straight to the back bedroom and shut the door, quiet as he could manage, the way a boy still hides sometimes, even once he's a grown man with 2 children of his own. "John, open the door." Mrs. Kessler didn't wait for anyone to reach it. She was already shouting through it. "What's wrong with your shop? John, you closed your shop?" Ellie answered the door instead. She told his mother John wasn't feeling well, had gone down with something, was resting, and no, she didn't think today was a good day for a visit. She said it gently, standing in the doorway, blocking just enough of it with her own body that his mother couldn't see past her. His mother looked at her for a moment, then she raised her voice past Ellie toward the back of the house. "John, I know you're in there, coward." She turned back to Ellie. "Tell him I called." "I called," she said, and got back in the car, and Ellie watched them pull away before she closed the door and went to find John still sitting on the edge of the bed in the dark, and neither of them said anything about what had just happened, then or ever. He worked out an arrangement with the landlord, too. 70% of what was left owed on the rental, in exchange for a promise to check over the landlord's own cars whenever they needed it. After all of it was finally settled, he lay down on the couch with the new cigarette in his mouth, unlit, and said, "Ellie, I have my charm. They still admire my ability." Several times he almost struck the lighter. Each time he pulled his hand back before he did. For weeks after that, he sat most evenings at the kitchen table with the newspaper open to the classifieds, the way his mother used to sit with it open to different pages entirely, the pencil moving around the page from left to right or top to bottom, sometimes with no order to it at all. "Back then, we were surrounded by names of cars nobody's ever heard of," he'd mutter to himself sometimes, for no reason anybody could follow. He stayed in the kitchen longer than he stayed in the living room most nights now. The dining table grew narrower and narrower under the piling newspapers, until there was barely room left for a plate. There was a night in March, though, when the circling meant something. He circled something in pencil and looked at it for a long time without feeling anything close to what he used to feel looking at possibility. At the bottom of the page, small enough that he'd almost turned past it, was a garage 500 miles northwest, in a town he'd never heard of, looking for an experienced mechanic. Year-round work, housing not included. "Dear, I want to find a job here." He pointed to the spot on the page he'd circled earlier. Ellie stopped her housework and bent down to read it. "It's quite far from here," she said. "I've never heard of this place before." "Yes, I know." His voice went up a little. "It's a real job. Steady, year-round." He lit another cigarette. "It's said to be a nice place." "Really?" "Yes. Believe me." He finished the cigarette already in his hand, then took up the pencil again and tapped it against the circled spot. "That's it. I want to get that job." He let the map do the rest of the talking. Later, when he spread it out on the table and put his finger on the little dot of a town, and then on the bigger dot that was where they were now, and measured the distance between them with the side of his hand, like it was something that could be shrunk by looking at it long enough. She didn't ask what kind of town it was, how many people lived there, whether there was a school. She asked one thing. "Will there be anybody there?" He didn't understand the question at first, and then he did, and it landed somewhere he didn't have a ready answer for. He had built his whole self around being known, around walking into a diner and having 3 men look up and say his name. And she was asking him gently, without meaning to strike anything, whether he'd thought about what it would cost him to walk into a town where nobody would. "There'll be you," he said. "There'll be the kids." It wasn't an answer to her question. John kept tracing circles on the map. He called the garage that same week, and a man named Harold Denning answered back, saying he could use a mechanic with John's kind of experience. "You know, they answered back to me today." John was expressing his excitement to Ellie this evening. He told her he'd go up ahead of them, get the job started, find a place they could afford, send word once there was something solid enough to bring a family to. He said it like a plan, laid out in clean, confident pieces, the way he said most things, and Ellie nodded along to it the way she agreed to most things. It was the first time since Christmas that John had sounded like that younger version of himself again. He packed one bag. He kept the single set of wrenches his father had given him the Christmas he turned 16 and left the rest boxed in the garage, since there was no shop left to need them and no room in the truck for much more than what he could throw in the back. Ellie stood on the porch with the two children the morning he left, one of them still half asleep against her shoulder, and John kissed her on the cheek and told her it wouldn't be long, and meant it the way he meant most things. Completely, in the moment he said it, with no particular claim on whether it would turn out to be true. He pulled out a little after 7. John watched the town go by in the mirror, the sign on Route 9 still up somewhere behind him, gray with weather now, Kessler Auto Shop, fading a little more with every rain, and did not look back at it, though he knew without looking that it was still there and would be for a while yet, since there was nobody left to take it down. Chapter 4. Sold. Ellie was sitting at the table by the kitchen. By some means, there had never been a proper dining room in the house. When they'd bought the place, John had taken one look at the bit of open space beside the kitchen and put their old dining table there instead, and said, the way he always said things like it, "One day we'll move to a bigger house. The kind you see on TV, yes, the luxury one." She wondered now how John was doing, 500 miles away. It had been several days since he'd left. The children kept asking where their father had gone, and she had to explain it to them again and again, in a mother's way. "Daddy is looking for a job for us. We have to wait." The phone rang. "Hello?" Ellie answered with a little caution. She'd picked up a few scam calls lately, and they'd unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. People trying to sell her things, and she couldn't work out how they'd even gotten her number. "Hello?" she said again. "Ellie, it's me, John." "It's good, Ellie, real good." His voice had some of its old lift back in it, the first time she'd heard that in months. "Harold likes my work. He wants me on steady, no trial period, nothing. I'm going to stay on here and keep at it." He paused, the way he did when he was about to ask for something and wanted it to sound like it wasn't a question. "I need you to sell the house, get the kids, and come on up." "Oh, okay," Ellie continued. "Do you need anything there?" "I have to go. A lot of work now. I'll call you again." John hung up the phone before she could say anything more. Ellie stood there listening to the flat buzzing sound coming from the receiver. That was the whole of it, or nearly. He'd said, before the rush of it, that Harold knew a fellow who might take the extra furniture off her hands cheap if it came to that. He hadn't said when he'd call again, or when he meant for her to come, or much else at all. And Ellie set the receiver back down and stood a moment in the quiet the house always seemed to fall into right after his voice left it. Since the last time older Mrs. Kessler had come by the house, they hadn't seen much of John's parents at all. Ellie had to call and ask whether they'd take the grandchildren for a few days. "Let John come back and talk to me," Mrs. Kessler said into the phone, before she agreed to anything else. Ellie brought some homemade bread along with the two children when she drove them over. At the door was Mrs. Kessler herself, who looked past Ellie toward the car, a little disappointment already settling into her face. "Where is he?" Ellie didn't have time to answer before older Mr. Kessler had already come up behind his wife and scooped both children in through the door. "Come in, Ellie," he said. And that was that. Whatever else his wife might have wanted to say about it, left standing in the doorway with nowhere to go. "He didn't think to tell me himself," John's mother said, standing in her own doorway with one of the children's hands still in hers. It wasn't really a question, so Ellie didn't try to answer it as one. "His own mother, and I hear it secondhand, from you, at my own front door." "I'm sorry," Ellie said, because it seemed like the thing that was owed, even though it wasn't really her apology to give. "Where is John?" Mrs. Kessler repeated the question. "He seems to be hiding somewhere?" Ellie set the bread down. "Mom, John and I always think about you and Dad." She went on before the silence could settle. "His business did go bad earlier, but he's been working hard. He found a new job, in Mountain Lion." Mountain Lion! Mrs. Kessler couldn't quite believe what she'd heard. "That's 500 or 600 miles from here. How did he find a job that remote?" Mr. Kessler looked surprised too, though calmer about it than his wife. Ellie smoothed a wrinkle out of her shirt with one hand. I know it's quite far, but John said they gave him a steady job. Good pay. So he's been there this whole time? Mrs. Kessler asked. Yes, Mom. We're planning to move there soon. Ellie's voice dropped lower, saying it. Mr. Kessler cut in. Ellie, what do you need from us? She turned to face him instead. I need to sell the house, if you wouldn't mind watching them for a while. Mrs. Kessler was still somewhere else entirely, trying to place the name on a map. Mr. Kessler answered for both of them. That's easy enough. Go on and sell your house. They'll be well looked after here. By the time Ellie left, her shirt had gone damp with sweat under the arms. But what she carried away with her, more than anything else said that afternoon, was Mrs. Kessler calling after her from the door. Have him call me. I need to talk to him. Ellie had never sold anything larger than a chair at a yard sale. That first week, she walked into the county offices not knowing where the records were kept, or how a person even proved they owned a house free and clear. She felt it most at the bank the first morning. The teller's polite face, the moment she had to say John's name out loud, the quick glance to see if the name already meant something. She needn't have worried as much as she did. The town turned out kinder than her nerves had expected. She needn't have been, or not as much as she was. The town turned out to be kinder than her nerves had given it credit for. The bank manager, a Mr. Colby, walked her through the paperwork himself instead of passing her off to someone junior, and didn't once make her feel foolish for not knowing the words for things. A woman 2 doors down, whose husband did some real estate on the side of his regular work, put a sign in the yard for nothing more than the promise of a pie later, and fielded most of the calls herself so Ellie didn't have to explain the situation to strangers over and over. Even the mailman, an older man named Otis who delivered to that house longer than Ellie had lived in it, told her one morning, apropos of nothing, that he was sorry to hear they were going, and that plenty of people in town wished John well, wherever he'd landed. The selling process went well. Soon Ellie got word that a young couple had taken an interest in the house. They were willing to put down a good deposit to secure the contract, if Ellie had no objection to the offer. John happened to call around that same time, asking whether she could put some money into the bank for him so he could rent a place of his own. Yes, just sell it. We need the money, was all he said, keeping the call short as always. Ellie didn't forget to remind him that his mother was still waiting on a call. This time, John actually followed through and called Mrs. Kessler himself. Whatever he told her, it seemed to bring her most of the way back around to her son's version of things. When Ellie went to pick the children back up, Mrs. Kessler was in high spirits, repeating to Ellie, "My son still has his charm. His new boss likes him. He'll get rich soon enough." Mr. Kessler, for his part, only seemed to wish the children could have stayed a little longer. Ellie was grateful for the days they'd had them, but she told him gently that she could manage them again now. 2 or 3 weeks after that, the house finally sold to the young couple for close enough to the asking price that Ellie didn't feel she needed to trouble John with the exact number over the phone. She signed what she could sign herself. For the rest, the bank told her they required John's signature too, since his name was on the deed alongside hers, and so a date was set for him to come back for the weekend, just long enough to put his name where it needed to go. He arrived on Thursday evening, thinner than he'd left, and stayed only long enough to eat dinner with the children and sleep one night in a house that already felt like it belonged to someone else. In the morning, they drove together to the bank and sat across from Mr. Colby and signed where they were told to sign, John's handwriting looser and faster than Ellie remembered it, like a man in a hurry to be done with something. When it was finished, Mr. Colby shook both their hands and wished them well. And outside on the sidewalk, John kissed Ellie on the cheek and said he'd see her soon, and got in the car and drove away, though Harold had told him he was welcome to take the whole weekend with his family. John had already started turning over some new idea in his head, some way he'd convinced himself might make him rich sooner than the shop ever could have, and he couldn't wait to get back to it. Ellie stood on the sidewalk a while after the car had turned the corner. Then she went back inside to finish what there still was to finish. She packed alone in the evenings after that, once the children were down, going room by room with a stack of newspaper and a roll of tape. The young couple who'd bought the house wanted it completely empty, so there was no sparing herself any of it. Every stick of furniture had to be sold, given away, or somehow fit into what little space the moving truck allowed. Ellie put a big garage sale sign out front, and every time a customer tried to bargain her down on a price, she accepted it, whatever it was. In the final days, Mr. Kessler started coming by too, always with some excuse about how he'd just been driving past, and ended up helping her haul furniture out to the yard and deal with the sale itself, on top of a lifetime of smaller things to sort through. Dishes wrapped in newspaper and boxed, the children's clothes folded into suitcases, a drawer of odds and ends that took her the better part of an evening just to decide what was worth carrying 500 miles and what wasn't. She found in the back of a closet one of John's undershirts from years before he'd ever thought of owning a shop, worn soft and gray with washing, and she folded it into the box with the wedding photograph and the other photographs, all together, and labeled the box 1980 to 1982, John and Ellie. Mrs. Kessler drove herself over this time, without anyone else along, and stood talking to Ellie in the yard among the tables of things for sale. "Have him call me," she said. "I looked up Mountain Lion, you know." She sighed a little. Still remote as I remembered. She sold nearly all of the furniture to a second-hand dealer 2 towns over, for less than she'd hoped, though she didn't trouble John with that number either. What was left of the money after the movers were paid, she kept folded in an envelope in her purse, counted twice a day out of habit more than need. By the end of the second week, the rooms had gone bare enough that her own footsteps sounded different in them, sharper, the way a voice sounds different in an empty church. The last night in the house, the boy asked her again why they were selling it, the same question he'd asked weeks before, as if some part of him had been hoping the answer might have changed in the meantime. "Because we're going to go live near your father," Ellie told him, folding the last of the towels into a box. "Why can't he come back here instead?" "Because his work is there now." She smoothed the flap of the box down and taped it shut. "We'll all be together again soon." The girl didn't ask anything. She only wanted to know if her bed was coming too. And Ellie told her yes, of course. Everything was coming, which was as true as it needed to be for a 6-year-old. And she tucked both children into the one mattress still left on the floor and sat with them until they were asleep. She lingered there a while longer, even though she was worn through after the week's work. In the morning, Ellie loaded what fit into the car and buckled the children into the back seat and did not look back at the house as she pulled away from it. When the engine started, she drove the same road her husband had driven weeks before, nothing behind them now but what they were leaving. Chapter 5. Route. John was waiting outside the new house when the car pulled in, and for a moment he almost didn't recognize it. Dust-covered, riding low with everything Ellie had managed to fit into it, the 2 children's faces pressed to the back window before the engine had even fully stopped. Then the doors opened, and it was just his family. His legs carried him toward the car before he knew he was moving, faster than he could remember moving in a long time. It felt, for those few strides, like he was crossing over the whole of the last 2 years at once. He held Ellie a long moment in the yard. "Kids have been sick," she said into his shoulder. "They've been crying the whole day's road." She got both children out of the car, and John guided them inside, into rooms, and put them down on the couch swiftly. "How was the trip?" John lit a cigarette once the children were settled. "I'm here." Ellie let out a breath. "I haven't driven 10 hours in a day before." She gave him a hug. "Do you have some medicine for the kids?" "That's good." He tapped the cigarette against the edge of the ashtray. "Everything is nice here." Then he went and slowly dug out a half-used bottle of medicine from a bunch of messy stuff in the kitchen. Ellie gave some to the children. He was happier than she'd seen him in a long time. That night, the family went to bed earlier than usual. The next morning, John brought Ellie around the house. Mountain Lion, 3 major peaks shaping themselves into the rough silhouette of a lion when the light hit them right, was smaller than anything John had lived near before. A couple thousand people scattered across a valley floor and up into the first low folds of the hills. One main street crossing the town, with the hardware store and a diner and a church and not much else. And beyond that, land. The air out here smelled different than it had back home, dry and a little sharp, carrying dust and sage, and, underneath that, the faint mineral smell of the mountains themselves. And the quiet took some getting used to, too. No traffic, no neighbors close enough to hear through a wall, just the frequency of the wind waving through the grass. "This is a big house." Ellie finally took in properly the house they'd arrived at the night before. "Yes, quite nice." John showed her the surroundings around the house. "This is ours now." Ellie looked a little surprised, though she didn't know how long they planned to stay here. "Yes, I bought it." John continued right on before she could say anything else. Beyond the yard was more land than John had ever stood in front of and thought of as belonging to anybody in particular. Harold Denning's garage sat at the edge of town, 2 bays and a gravel lot, and the room John had been renting above the hardware store was, as advertised, not much. 1 window, a hot plate, a bed too narrow for 2 people who'd gotten used to more room than that. It wouldn't do for a family, and John had known that before Ellie ever got in the car, though he hadn't quite let himself think through what would do instead until the day before she arrived, when Harold mentioned, almost as an aside, that there was a place going for cheap a few miles of town, an old homestead, 30 acres, a house that needed work and a well that needed more, empty since the last family who'd tried to make a go of it had given up on it 2 winters back. "It's been on sale for a while," Harold said. "The town's quite boring here, but the land's big if you don't mind putting some effort into it." John planned only a short visit to the house, not intending to buy it. But when they drove out to the homestead, the land, the size of the place, and the abandoned barn made him feel different than he had about his old place. To John, luxury had always just meant big, and 30 acres was bigger than anything he'd ever stood on before. Bigger even than the houses he used to picture on TV. He felt drawn to the land almost in spite of himself, despite the fact that he hadn't expected Mountain Lion to have so few people, or to sit so far out from anywhere. Standing in that yard, nobody around for a mile in any direction, 30 acres of empty ground felt for a moment like a place a man could bury a bad history and grow something else entirely on top of it. Harold seemed to guess what he was thinking. "It's a good deal, if you want it. I can put you in touch with a good man for the process." "Quick?" John tried to hold back his joy, as though he'd just found a piece of paradise meant for no one but him and Ellie, more land for him to set his ambitions and spirit loose on. He signed the papers on it 3 days before Ellie and the children arrived, using money that should have gone further toward rent in town, and did not entirely regret it even once he understood, giving her directions to it over the phone the night before, just how alone that stretch of road really was. No other houses to mark the way, the last stretch turning to gravel and then to something that was barely road at all. John's enthusiasm carried them both along. "Look at this. How big the kitchen is, the dining room, and there are a couple of rooms for the kids." Ellie followed where he led her, her shoes loud on floorboards that hadn't heard footsteps in 2 winters, the whole house smelling of dust and old wood smoke, and something faintly sweet underneath, like the walls themselves had soaked up 100 dinners cooked by a family that wasn't theirs. "And we've got a spa room, though it needs some repair, but I call it the accessory of the luxury." "Our room's quite big too," he said, showing it to her. When they went into the bathroom, the shower head suddenly fell loose. John caught it before it hit the tile. "Just a little repair, nothing hard." He set it back in place and grinned at her. "Let me show you something else." He took her by the arm and led her back outside. It had been a while, since before he'd left, that the 2 of them had walked arm in arm like that. They crossed to the barn. "Isn't it something?" John let go of her arm and climbed the stairs up to the loft, waving down at her. "Can you hear me?" She looked up. There he was, already standing on the 2nd floor. The barn was huge and tall, big enough, she thought, to invite all her family if they ever came this far. Afterward, they walked the rest of the land together, too. The house had electricity, run out from town on a line that flickered more than John would have liked whenever the wind picked up. The well gave enough water for a household, once John and a man that Harold had recommended to him got the pump working properly again, though it ran brown for the first several days before it cleared. It kept the traditional way of heating, a wood stove in the front room that would have to heat the whole house once winter came, and John found himself that first month doing more manual labor in the evenings after a full day at Harold's garage than he had done in all his years running his own shop, hauling water, patching the roof where it had started to go, clearing out the wood stove itself. Ellie took her own time adjusting to the new place. Their old town hadn't been much to speak of either, not really, but next to Mountain Lion it might as well have been an aircraft carrier. A whole town's worth of noise and neighbors and errands to run, compared to this. Over the next 3 weeks, Harold helped arrange for the telephone company to run a line out to the house. It was a convenience for the whole family once it was finally in. The first call John made on it was to his parents, to his mother really, since that was who answered. Mrs. Kessler had been so eager to hear from her son that she tracked the number down herself, calling Harold's garage directly to get it, which had left Harold more than a little surprised to find himself on the phone with John's mother one afternoon. Once John got on the line, she wasted no time telling him that DT had turned up back in their old town, suddenly, out of nowhere, and that word was he'd run up a mountain of debt with some gambling outfit. Men who'd taken to showing up at his parents' door nearly every day now, looking to collect. "Well, Mom," John said, "I've got a new life out here now. That guy's not my business anymore." "Yes, he's total garbage," Mrs. Kessler giggled again. "You're the one who's going to make something wonderful of yourself." John hung up the phone that evening feeling lighter than he had in months. Some evenings that first month, after Ellie and the children were asleep and the wood stove had burned down to wood, John found his mind wandering back to it all, to how things might have gone if he'd never hired DT in the first place, or hired some steadier mechanic instead, someone who wouldn't have needed watching. Soon it was the numbers he'd started noticing again in the newspaper that caught him instead. Stock prices printed small in columns he'd skipped past his whole life without once reading closely. He started keeping the pages, folding them into a stack by the wood stove, and the columns of numbers pulled him in the way a good novel might have, if John had ever been a man for novels. One evening he caught an advertisement on the television, a machine the size of a small TV set itself, with rows of buttons for punching in numbers by hand, a man's voice over the picture saying, "Go with the trends. Go large with life." And something about the phrase lodged itself in him and wouldn't come loose. He drove into the next town over one Saturday, telling Ellie he wanted to see about a radio for the kitchen, and came back instead having spent an hour at the appliance store looking at a home computer in the window. A boxy thing, a screen the color of a fish tank, a price tag that made him whistle under his breath even standing alone in front of it. He told himself, walking around it, that a man ought to keep up with where the world was headed, that it wasn't so different, really, from a man keeping his tools sharp. Then it caught him. This was the very machine from the ad, the one that said, "Go with the trends. Go large with life. Go large with life." He kept repeating it under his breath. That same night, he even dreamed he'd become the man in the advertisement himself, standing there holding up the sign with the words printed across it. Go with the trends. Go large with life. He went back 3 more Saturdays for the same product. In the end, a loan through the same little bank that had financed the well repair, a note co-signed against the farm itself, was what finally bought him the machine from the ad, the one that was going to help him go large with life. John drove it home in the bed of the truck wrapped in a moving blanket, and told Ellie it was for keeping the farm's books straight, for the children's schooling later on, for a dozen reasons that were all half true and none of them the real one. He set it up on a card table in the corner of the front room, behind the wood stove, where the light was bad and Ellie rarely had reason to sit. Ellie thought it was just a normal appliance, like a TV or a refrigerator. She didn't notice the trends of the new technology at all. Ellie worked too, though she said less about it than John said about his own labor. She scrubbed the kitchen down to bare wood, her hands raw by the end of most days from the lye soap and lukewarm water, and painted over what she couldn't scrub clean. The smell of fresh paint fighting the old smoke smell for a week or two before it won. She found, in a shed behind the barn, a dozen mason jars left by the family before them, and set about learning, from a neighbor woman a mile down the road, how to put up vegetables for winter, since the nearest real grocery was 18 miles into the next town over, and John's wage from Harold, steady as it was, wasn't going to stretch to cover everything a family of 4 needed if half of it had to come from a store. It was Ellie, in fact, who raised the idea of the cow. She was rooted to the land with her husband now. "Mrs. Halverson down the road says a milk cow would save us more than you'd think," she said one evening, not quite looking at him while she said it, the way she said most things that were closer to a plan than a question. "And maybe some chickens. For eggs." John turned the idea over for a moment the way he turned over most ideas, out loud, testing how it sounded coming out of his own mouth. "A farm," he said. Something quieter, slower, the kind of life his older generations might have lived, a ground with the animals on it. The loans John still had jumped to his mind, more money, which was always good. "A farm," he said again, and nodded, like a man agreeing to something he'd thought of himself. "We'll get a farm.